You can run it from there.
Cool. Hello. Our speaker tonight is Mike Beug or Michael Beug, and he's been a pioneer in mycology and fungal education. Sorry, I'm hitting the mic. He taught at Evergreen State College for over 30 years, where he's inspired generations of scientists. And he's pretty extensively published, sorry. And he helped shape North American mushroom identification through his work with NAMA, and he continues to be a key voice in culinary and medicinal mushrooms. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear from him. Mike, if you want to share your screen and start, you're all good to go.
Okay, here we go. We clicked the right button anyway. There. This is a talk that I normally like to give as two separate talks. One about the mushrooms that change your mind and your spirit, and another about medicinal and culinary mushrooms. But we're going to squeeze it all into one talk tonight. In the first half of it, well, if I can figure out how to make this advance here. There we go. First half of it will be psychotropic fungi. And I'll start with the mushrooms that contain ibotenic acid and mucimol. Now, these mushrooms are two that I do not consider of any interest as a psychotropic fungus. They do change your perception of size, your perception of time, but you typically fall into a deep comatose sleep, and that coma can last anywhere from 6 hours to 70 hours, depending on how much you ate and how strong the mushrooms were. And you can have some very violent dreams, and you wake up the next day with little memory of what had happened. But sometimes there's a physical reminder. And I learned about these first from Dr. Daniel Stuntz at the University of Washington when I was just a beginner. Somebody had given me a bag of morels in the summer of 1968. My wife and I were just married. They were so delicious. And then when I was out steelheading on the Olympic Peninsula, we picked 2 grocery bags of these beautiful bright red cap mushrooms with kind of cream colored warts, brought them into the chemistry department at the University of Washington, where I was working on my doctorate. I had no interest in mushrooms prior to this particular summer, and I couldn't find anyone who knew what I had. And I eventually learned about Dr. Stuntz in the botany department next door and took a non-credit course from him. And that's the only formal training I have in biology, mycology, or botany. However, I've been trained indirectly by the best of the best, including Dr. Orson Miller, Dr. Alexander H. Smith, and my main mentor, Kit Skates Barnhart, who learned her mushrooms from Dr. Smith. Anyway, the story that really struck me was there's this couple in Western Washington State. They knew if you boiled the mushroom that you detoxified it. So they boiled their mushroom and then they cooked it up, but then they used the mushroom water to make their spaghetti sauce. So pretty soon the neighbors heard all this commotion over at the house, furniture breaking and everything being tipped over. They ran over, rushed the parents to the hospital, and while they were gone, the son came home, didn't observe the fact that the house was all broken up, sat down to dinner, and the parents got home just in time to take the son to the hospital too. And they fully recovered after 6 to 8 hours, but they had expensive hospital bills. And then the other story that Dr. Stuntz told me was somebody eating a member of the Amanita pantherina group, and he imagined that he was being thrown off of a cliff, and he was clawing with all of his might to hang on and not go over the side of the cliff. He woke up in the car in the morning, his steering wheel was broken, his dash was ripped apart, and the ceiling headliner was torn out. And he had no recollection of that, but he had one heck of a bill to deal with afterwards. And these mushrooms have no known medicinal value. They have been used in brain chemistry research, but it isn't a do-it-yourself at home thing. In contrast, the psilocybin mushrooms, the mushrooms that cause strange vision, which were introduced to the general public in 1957 by R. Gordon Wasson, he had gone to Mexico, and he was served on several occasions 6 pair of these small hallucinogenic mushrooms. At the time, we didn't have a name for them. They did not know what was in them. I was 13 years old when this came out. We subscribed to Life magazine at home, but I'm sure my parents disappeared it. And I never heard about these mushrooms at all until 1975. We'll talk about that further in a moment. But meanwhile, people, young folks in particular from all over the United States flooded Mexico, and they used this Life magazine and the watercolors of the hallucinogenic mushrooms as their guide to go to Mexico and collect mushrooms and trip out. And in the bottom right corner, I want to draw your particular attention to Psilocybe cubensis, because Timothy Leary and Albert Hoffman were young psychologists at Harvard University. And Timothy Leary traveled to Mexico to find out about these mushrooms that cause strange visions. And he was not able to find the really good, potent mushrooms, but he was introduced to Psilocybe cubensis. And then on return to Harvard, he was able to obtain pure psilocybin and psilocin from Dr. Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD. He was a Swiss biochemist working for Sandoz chemical company, and he's the man that identified the active ingredients in the genus psilocybin and psilocybe, and he had named the 2 chemicals psilocybin and psilocin. And if you ingest the mushrooms, the psilocybin quickly dephosphorylates and turns into psilocin, and that's the active ingredient. So Andrew Weil, who was an undergraduate, wanted access to the mushrooms, and he was also on the editorial board of the Harvard newspaper, The Crimson. So he published what was going on with graduate students, and there were rumors of rather risque sexual exploits, which don't seem to be accurate from what I learned later. But they were also doing serious research with the effect of psilocybin and psilocin on the local prison. But as a result of the article, both Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were fired. And Timothy went around the country talking about dropping out, and became very active in the anti-Vietnam War veteran, anti-Vietnam War activity, I should say. Richard Alpert took on the name Ram Dass. And until 2010, when Britt Bunyard asked me to write an article for Fungi magazine about psilocybin and psilocin, I had no idea what Ram Dass meant. And it turns out it means servant of God. And Richard Alpert had been a non-practicing Jew, but the experience of the mushrooms, which my students later were co-authors in calling them entheogens, because they really opened up your perspective, your empathy for others, your religious perspective. And Richard Alpert went to India and studied Eastern religions, and wound up spending much of the rest of his life at Brighton Bush in Oregon, where he led holistic retreats. And so this is Psilocybe cubensis in culture. It's readily cultivated. It's now legal to cultivate it, at least I'm not sure the exact laws in Denver, but Colorado has passed a law, and Oregon has a law that allows you to use this mushroom in a supervised session. They've decriminalized it, but it's still illegal to use it on your own. And in 1975, I was still totally unaware of psilocybin and psilocin. It wasn't mentioned in any of my books, but I was in my 4th year of teaching at the Evergreen State College. And in my first year, a small group of students came and wanted to study ethnobotany, and that included study of Amanita muscaria and its relatives. And then I got involved in just doing environmental research on shutting down the use of DDT, PCBs, heavy metals. But Paul Stamets, Jonathan Ott, and Jeremy Bigwood were the 3 of about 8 students who came to my office in 1975 wanting to learn about mushrooms. And it turned out that these three were particularly interested in the genus Psilocybe. And by this early 1976, Jeremy Bigwood had arranged for me to get a Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4 drug license, prescription pad, and pure psilocybin and psilocin from the U.S. government. It never dawned on me that Jeremy most likely was not a real student and was somebody from the government sent to keep an eye on Evergreen, which is a very liberal school at the time. And this pasture in the lower right-hand corner is next to my house, and I was in walking distance from Evergreen. And these students are engaged in what's called the Liberty Cap Stoop. The field turned out to be totally covered with Psilocybe semilanceata, which is a mushroom that has very consistent 1% psilocybin and rarely has any psilocin at all. Now, Jonathan Ott went on to become great friends with Albert Hoffman, and he translated Hoffman's book, LSD, My Problem Child, into English. And in the spring of '76, the students organized the first International Psilocybin Mushroom Conference. In the upper left picture, Scott Chilton, one of my graduate professors, is talking with Gaston Guzman, the world expert on the genus Psilocybe. In the top right, it's Dr. Daniel Stuntz. In the middle picture, he's this incredible mycologist from the University of Washington. He personally had no interest in psilocybin and psilocin, but he was at the conference. In the lower left, in the black hat, fittingly, is Dr. Andrew Weil. And then the next picture over in the red hat is Dr. Alexander H. Smith. He's one of the 2 world's leading mycologists at the time. And because we had a scanning electron microscope at Evergreen State College, he would regularly come to Evergreen to work with Paul Stamets. And so one of the ways that Paul and I learned an awful lot about mushrooms was from Alex. And in this picture, he's talking to Gary Linkoff, who is many times the president of the North American Mycological Association. And some of the politics of the psilocybe mushrooms is highlighted by the story of Stephen Pollock, who's known as the Texas psilocybe doctor. And several years after the psilocybe mushroom conferences, Paul Stamets was talking to Steve Pollock on the phone. The doorbell rang. Steve went to the door. Paul heard gunshots. And it turns out it was a Texas Ranger who showed up to assassinate Steve Pollock and get rid of that awful psilocybe mushroom doctor. But the truth about psilocybin and psilocin is really quite innocuous and quite different. There's no known lethal dose for psilocybin and psilocin, and it's anti-addictive. If you use it 4 days or more in a row, it quits working. It really is a drug for a pathway out of mushrooms. And for a long time, I didn't realize that it had some very important medicinal benefits, which we will get into shortly. But this time period is when a large number of books are being published about mind-altering mushrooms. Paul Stamets' senior thesis requirement involved writing with Scott Chilton, the mushroom cultivator, and he also wrote psilocybe mushrooms and their allies for the other half of his senior thesis. And Jonathan Ott and Jeremy Bigwood did theononocotyl hallucinogenic mushrooms of the Gods, and there were several other books in the same time period. And the main proponent of psilocybin and psilocin at the time is Terence McKenna. And he believed that humans discovered this mushroom maybe 100, 200,000 years ago as they were following ungulates, and they would find these large Psilocybe cubensis, and it has one look-alike that's about the same. They're rather tasty mushrooms that grow on the droppings of elephants and water buffaloes and the wild cattle, and eating those mushrooms changed their mind. And his theory was that these mushrooms literally expanded your minds. Well, my main teacher and person who got me into photography and talked about mushrooms a lot was Kit Skates. Later, she became Kit Skates Barnhart, and she would come out in the fall to Olympia, Washington, to help put on the Autumn show, mushroom show. Before there was a mushroom club in Olympia. In fact, there was only one in the Northwest, the newly formed Puget Sound Mycological Society in the late 1960s. But Margaret McKinney died in the late 1960s, but Kit Skates and Alex Smith would come to put on a show. So in 1971, I took my students down and we helped arrange the show. And I formed a lifelong friendship with Alex, and particularly with Kit Skates, who became the honorary third grandmother of my children. Now, this is important because Kit decided she really wanted to know what psilocybin and psilocin mushrooms were all about. So after I'd been researching these for 10 years, I'd never tried them, and I decided that on the very last of what would be 10 years of annual psilocybin mushroom forays, and they had now been moved to Brighton Bush in Oregon, a hot springs resort. I picked about 200 Psilocybe semilanceata and brought them down. And I was staying in a cabin. This is in an old growth forest, and the cabin was about a 1910s, 1920s era geothermally heated cabin, and just a beautiful set and setting. It was kind of a dark, drizzly night. We had just had dinner. So Gary Linkoff, Linnea Gilman, who some of you I'm sure know, Kit Skates, and I were going to try the mushrooms that night. And Maggie Rogers, a retired librarian and another NAMA member from the Oregon Mycological Society, was our observer or safety. And I had calculated that 15 Liberty Caps was the same strength as the 12 pair of mushrooms that R. Gordon Wasson had taken in Mexico. So what I did is I gave each person 15 of the 200 mushrooms, and we all ate them. And in about 40 minutes, Gary Linkoff and Linnea Gilman were both totally be-mushroomed. And they left and went over to Terence McKenna's lecture in the main lodge at Brighton Bush. And Kit and I are looking at each other, and everything's totally normal. No change in size, perception, no colors. And so we decided, well, we needed to try some more mushrooms. And being rather impatient, we decided to try 30 more mushrooms each so that we would have a total of 45. Now, 15 is considered what was later described as a heroic dose, full-scale hallucinations. And we did our 45 apiece, and we waited and waited, and again, nothing happened. So we just decided to divide up the remaining mushrooms. So we had basically at the end, we had about, let's see, it would be 170 by 2 divided by 2, 85 Liberty Caps apiece, with 15 being enough for a heroic dose. And Kit and I, with Maggie, went over to sit in on Terence McKenna's lecture. And Terence is sort of droning on about how psilocybe mushrooms are being from Mars. And Gary Linkoff, who gets very silly when he's high on mushrooms, was egging him on. And Kit and I are sitting there and everything is still totally normal. And we're both feeling rather disappointed. And somebody was passing around a bag of psilocybe cyanescens. Now, psilocybe cyanescens is twice as strong as Liberty caps. And as the bag went by me, I took a handful. I didn't count how many it was, and I ate that handful of psilocybe cyanescens. And the other thing about cyanescens is it has baocystin and norobaocystin, as well as psilocybin and psilocin. And so it's a little bit more visual a mushroom than just Psilocybe semilanceata. But Terence's lecture came to an end after another about 40 minutes, and it was time to retire for the evening. So Kit and Maggie Rogers and I walked out of the room, out of the hall as the lecture was ending, and somebody was standing on the front porch with a big bag, a couple big bags of Psilocybe cubensis. So I ate a double handful of those as I walked Maggie and Kit back to their cabin and said good night. And then I went over to meet with David Repke, who was researching baocystin and norobaocystin while I was working on psilocybin and psilocin. And his roommates were all just very quietly on the floor, totally zoomed out on their trip. And the interesting thing about being around people who are tripping on mushrooms, and I've been around over 1,000 at this point, it's the most quiet, peaceful thing you can imagine. So Repke and I are talking, and he brought some wonderful David Bruce wines. I'm a winemaker, and I've been making wines now for 52 years at that point. I was producing good wines, but not yet the world-class wines that I make now. But we enjoyed 3 bottles of a nice David Bruce red Cabernet Sauvignon. And it was after midnight. And I said goodnight to Repke, and I walked back to my cabin. And at this point, I'm incredibly disappointed. It's drizzling rain, but it's just a normal, wet Pacific Northwest rainforest situation. I crawled into bed in my cabin and closed my eyes and left the planet. And there's these incredible blue shapes and forms forming and changing. It was all very geometric forms, incredibly beautiful. But I was feeling very, very out of body. And first I left my body, then I left the planet, then I left the solar system. And after a while, I was wondering if I could ever get back again. And so I opened my eyes. And as soon as I opened my eyes, everything was normal again. I went over and I woke up Kit and Maggie, and they came back. Kit was desperate to get some more psilocybin and psilocin. That had no effect on her whatsoever. But I'd eaten everything. There was nothing left. And so I laid down and closed my eyes, pulled my sleeping bag over my head. And by then, Gary and Linnea had returned, and I narrated the trips for the next hour or so. And whenever I felt too far away, I would just open my eyes, get up, make some notes, talk. Everything was normal until I laid down again and closed my eyes. So I have such a strong personality, I guess, that as soon as I didn't have my eyes closed, everything was normal. And so the next morning I got up and I met with Paul Stamets and Andrew Weil at breakfast, told them what had happened. Their eyes grew very wide at how much I had done. But I had to get back up to my vineyard. I live in the Columbia River Gorge, about halfway between Mount Adams and Mount Hood. And you can drive straight to my place on logging roads in about 2.5 hours from Brighton Bush. So I started off in my Volkswagen. I got about half hour down the road and I couldn't keep the car on the road anymore. And I couldn't figure out what kind of a trip had taken over. And I got out of the car, really panicked, wondering how I was going to get home. And then I looked and I saw the left front tire was completely gone. I'd been running on a flat. So I put a spare on and drove on home without further ado. But for the next 10, 15 years, actually forever thereafter, I was really sensitive to people in trouble, to people who overdid drugs. It would make me cry very easily, make me extremely empathetic. And for a long time, I thought it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And then in 2010, when the research was coming out of Johns Hopkins, and those folks were calling me to talk about how what they were doing compared to the data I had gathered on wild mushrooms from the 1970, mid 1970s till when I quit doing research on the mushrooms, really in about 1985, I realized that these mushrooms had changed me for the better. And I realized then that they had been made illegal because they were making it hard to fight the Vietnam War. Now, the Amanita muscaria and Amanita pantherina group mushrooms make people very warlike, and so they're totally legal. But the one thing the feds do not want is a very peaceful bunch of people that don't want to go to war with each other. And so these became Schedule 1 drugs. And then we had no further meetings, no further gatherings there. And the next gathering was in Colorado, and very soon moved to Telluride. Manny Salzman, who many of you know from Denver, sort of organized the Telluride mushroom conferences. I only made it to those conference once. But in 1999, we had an end of the biennium mushroom conference. And I'm in the middle of the front row, and Andy Wild is sort of in a red shirt immediately behind me. You can see Gary Linkoff. Manny Salzman is standing next to David Aurora, about the three people in from the right-hand side and 3 rows back. But everybody is there. Paul Stamets, the discoverer of ecstasy, and everyone is tripping at this conference except me. We have the Magic Kool-Aid bus, and I get to sit and visit all night with, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name, the guy in the red shirt up on top of the bus, the author of One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest, sometimes a great low notion. And anyway, I jammed all night with the Merry Pranksters, Ken Kesey, and I talked at the break, and it was a great, memorable evening. And the very next time I got involved with the hallucinogenic mushrooms was at Telluride in August of 2011. I'm down in the bottom left picture. And the Telluride conferences have gotten much more elaborate in terms of costumes. And this year, Paul Stamets is going to be there once again. But it was at this conference that Paul had discovered that his mother, he told me that he found his mother had been diagnosed with a terminal breast cancer. One breast was 50% larger than the other. When she reported to the hospital, her lymph nodes were swollen to the size of walnuts. And unbeknownst to the oncologist who enrolled her in a stage 1 turkey tail mushroom trial, she did not know that she was dealing with Paul Stamets' mother. And it wasn't until Paul's mother realized that she was being treated with Paul's host defense turkey tail mushrooms, and she had complete recovery from this cancer within about a month and a half, and lived to a ripe old age of about 95 with no recurrence of the cancer. And I had been very much a disbeliever in the use of medicinal mushrooms to heal cancer, etc. And I was still solely focused on the psilocybin research, which I'm going to continue to talk about, but we'll return to her case soon. Michael Pollan wrote How to Change Your Mind, and about the psychedelics. We had some long talks. And News Magazine in 2021 comes out with a new treatment for depression, magic mushrooms. And this is at this point recognized by U.S. Food and Drug Administration as a breakthrough drug. We still can't get it legalized in the United States. It can be dangerous when improperly used, but in the right setting with the right preparation, it's a miraculous drug. And what I was particularly interested in was this particular comparison that is going to be in Paul Stamets' new book coming out in June of 2014 about the genus about psilocybin mushrooms. You notice alcohol on the very far left. The red portion of the graph is how dangerous it is to others. The blue portion is how dangerous it is to you. And at the very far right, the very safest thing is mushrooms, specifically psilocybin mushrooms, but they have some danger to you, but no danger to others. And so this is of real importance as far as I'm concerned. One of the best things you can do for cluster buster headaches is a psilocybin, much better than any drugs that the psychologists have come up with, and much more effective. And there's quite an interest in the cluster busters. And yeah, I've got to figure out what has happened here.
Everybody's had trouble.
Yeah, I'm going. Oh, there we go. One more. So
Not that he's been eating mushrooms that's making him forgetful or making him have trouble.
I can't quite understand what you're saying. Well, but it's not just cluster buster headaches are way more severe than migraines. They're so severe that sufferers often commit suicide. And so, but mushrooms are proved, the psilocybe mushrooms are proving to be a wonderful drug for them. And also, because the autistic brain is rather different than the human brain, in preliminary studies, it looks like these can be really important in helping with autism. And there's a number of studies going on. This is one of the autistic studies going on. Now, it's important to recognize that bipolar people probably should not take these mushrooms at all, and definitely should do it under very careful supervision, because they can be disastrous for people with bipolar conditions. But they're really good for people suffering depression, for people with substance abuse, spousal abuse. It's a good route off of alcohol, a good route off of smoking. And so I visited one of the new Oregon facilities called Vital Reset. They thought I was just a mycologist. They had no idea I had been researching psilocybin and psilocin for decades. And I wound up spending a half a day talking to them about the work that they're doing. And I'm really excited about that. I would like to see that movement go nationally. And it's one of the things that we're working with the Medicinal Mushroom Committee on NAMA. And the other thing that we're working with the Medicinal Mushroom Committee on NAMA is the potential use of medicinal and culinary fungi to in treatment of cancer, in obesity, and diabetes, because there's about 300 fungal species that have medicinal effect. There's over 100 therapeutic uses. Most importantly is the anti-inflammatory use, the immunomodulating use, and hepatoprotective effects. But they're low in fat and are an incredible nutritional source of proteins, minerals, vitamins, and essentially amino acids. And on a side note, if we can cut our consumption of beef, we can start cutting some of our global methane emissions and that contributes significantly, like up to 20% to the global warming effect. And there's a whole bunch of studies out. Now, these studies are all summarized in two articles that I have on my website. Mushroomsofcascadia.com is my website. And you go to Michael's Extras, and down there, there's use of medicinal and culinary mushrooms, two articles. One is an article about the various people that I have worked with who have had cancer, and primarily cancer, and the other is a summary of the recipes and the uses. And these are updated every couple of months as I learn more. And I really got deeply involved in 2021 when a former there was a researcher at the Evergreen State College that overlaps my time and Paul Stamets' time. She had been doing endocrinology research, and at Evergreen was doing phage research. And so she was diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer, stage 3B. And this is totally incurable cancer, unlike many other cancers. And she was told that with radiation and with chemo or with immunotherapy, she might live another 18 to 24 months. And right away, she came to me and asked if we could try and deal with the cancer using mushrooms as an adjunct and not as a sole source, but something to help. So I called Paul Stamets, and his response was that, well, we were in uncharted territory. He couldn't offer any help, but also at the same time that I had heard about Paul Stamets' mother, a best friend of mine who had been working with this woman. His wife had been working with the woman who was now diagnosed with lung cancer, and he, in 2009, had been diagnosed with metastasized prostate cancer. That cut out his prostate, had to take out part of his kidney, and the cancer was all throughout his body. And they are anti-vaxxers, and they did not want any medical treatment, and they decided to deal with his cancer via diet and using the turkey tail mushrooms, just those two things. And for 10 years, he was doing quite well with just the turkey tail mushrooms. But by 2010, his normal weight, which is around between 135 and 140, was down to 100, and his PSA had soared to 300, where 3 to 4 is a good value, 5 you start to worry about. And at that point, my wife and I had been diagnosed with pneumonia, and I put that in my Christmas letter. And a friend of ours in Canada, Martin Osis, who is a member of NAMA and is also a member of the Pacific Northwest Key Council that I belong to, said, well, they had a cream you could rub on your chest and back that would rapidly cure pneumonia. And we decided that we would try this cream against my friend's prostate cancer. So in 2020, Martin, who lived only about an hour from my friend in Canada, and a friend of his, Kevin Rurak, made some creams for the prostate survivor. And right away, it was clear that the creams were working and bringing down his PSA.
It's interesting.
Well, it was, but he's into anecdotes.
Yeah, these are the anecdotes. So after 9 months, his PSA is down to 5, and his weight is back up to 135 to 140. So based on those anecdotes, I started using first the mushrooms and soon the creams with this patient with the incurable cancer, the lung cancer, stage 3B. And it was three weeks after starting the mushrooms, she had detected the cancer from a swollen lymph node. And we were meeting with the oncologist, And she said, I think the lymph node is smaller. And he checked it and he says, yeah, it's down by about 20%. 3 weeks later, we start the immunotherapy. The first 6 days go very, very well. The 7th day, she's passed out on the floor, incoherent, and they promptly took her off of the immunotherapy drug. And in 3 weeks after removing her from the immunotherapy drug, we did another PET CT scan. The swollen lymph node was no longer detectable. It still had some metabolic activity. The foggy images that they had from the lungs showed that the lungs were clear. But as soon as the patient was recovered and not trusting the mushrooms to work, she tried a second immunotherapy drug, and it took 2 months to recover from that one. But it only took a week or about 10 days before the oncologist pulled her off of that drug and turned her management over 100% to me, which is where it has been ever since. And we check in with the oncologist every 3 to 6 months. And the next PT, the next scan is going to be on Wednesday this week, but it's been over 3 years. The patient is at normal body weight, and she has absolutely no noticeable symptoms. I had at one point cut her dose back because early in her treatment, I miscalculated what they had used on Paul's mom, and I was giving her twice as much. So I figured the amount that they'd given Paul's mom would be enough. But when I cut back, her dose went, her cancer came back. And there was a huge lump on her back and a huge, about a silver dollar sore that wouldn't heal, and no doctors could help us. And she was also covered with a candida infection, external infection from her belly button to her knees. And that they'd been fighting that for 6 months without success. So I called my friends in Canada, and they suggested, well, trying shiitake extract to see if that would help soothe the discomfort. And I couldn't get any, so I went to the store and I bought some fresh shiitake, and I made a tea using 5 ounces of fresh shiitake and 2 quarts of water. And she drank a cup of that in the morning and a cup of that in the evening for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, the candida infection was completely cleared up. Now she continued using the tea, because what I haven't mentioned is for 25 years, she had been in consistent pain, so much pain that she would just get up in the morning, go to the couch. Her weight had ballooned to 200 pounds. With the cancer, she had gone on an intensive diet, got her weight back to 140. But 3 months after starting the tea, she was reporting a pain level of 5 rather than 10 or 10 plus. And a year after starting the tea, she was reporting little to no pain. So I made a separate discovery that made me very, very excited. So these are some of the mushrooms that I'm excited about for culinary use that are also extremely good as medicinal mushrooms. And the King Bolete group, and that includes the Boletus rubriceps in Colorado, the Boletus edulis that we have in the Northwest, and Boletus borosii. All of those are about 100 times as valuable medicinally to eat than eating the agaricus that you buy in the store. The oyster mushrooms are anywhere from 10 to 40 times as good for you as that store-bought mushroom. And then in the lower left is a cultivated shiitake. This is a mushroom that has been extremely important in the work that I'm doing with this lung cancer patient, but I really think it has tremendous potential though for women that suffer and men who suffer candida infections. It's way more powerful, and it makes a pleasant tea. She keeps it in the refrigerator. She now drinks like about 1/4 of a cup a day for maintenance. And then hericium mushrooms, particularly lion's mane on the far right, and bear's head and bear's tooth in the center. The one in the center is what I'd call bear's head. It grows on hardwoods, where bear's head, Hericium beatus, which is one of my favorite tasty edible mushrooms, grows on on conifers. But the Hericiums taste a lot like shellfish, and you can make wonderful imitation crab cakes from lion's mane. And the Hericium beatus is just richly flavored. So just quit eating that garbage they sell you in the grocery stores, the agaricus, and eat these valuable mushrooms. Because what we find is that the people that have a lot of mushrooms in their diet, and not the mushrooms that Americans eat that are primarily agaricus, brunescens, and they're all the same species, just different sizes and colors. And one of the things, everyone talks a lot about beta D glucans, which are very important, but ergothioneine is also a potential for help in healthy aging. And it's only produced by fungi, cyanobacteria, and some bacteria. And it's associated with decreased mortality, decreased cardiovascular risk, and decreased Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Okay, I'm tired of him. I think he's rambling now.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and so if we look down at the bottom, the Parkinson's death rate is way lower in
He was certainly
Japan than
well
here.
spoken.
Yeah.
Did you want me to stop, or do you have a question? So I recommend that you read Hobbs' Medicinal Mushrooms, the Essential Guide, if you're interested, Rogers, The Human Clinical Trials, but neither one of these do the things that I am currently doing. And as I mentioned earlier,
Anytime the speaker starts insulting somebody that's not him, like your supermarket
All right,
mushrooms,
Yeah.
I'm through.
Can you mute yourself, please?
I'm
Where are you supposed to get them if not the supermarket?
well, you can buy
Nothing from the woods.
shiitake in the supermarket. You can buy oyster mushrooms in the supermarket. You can buy lion's mane in the supermarket. Cordyceps militaris is going to be harder to find, but there's a lot of people growing it, and it's really delicious. And a lot of people are picking their own turkey tails, but then a lot of people are actually growing them and making interesting medicinal chemicals. And so here's a summary of some of the papers. I published a paper last summer in McIlvainea. It's got 200 references. I'll have an update with another 200 that have been published just in the last year. There's a tremendous interest in medicinal mushrooms. And one of the things that I am really intrigued by, in addition to turkey tail, which is, by the way, brown reishi, according to the Chinese, Inonotus obliquus, I recommend you use little or none of, because you can die from drinking too much of that tea. But Peckymeholan is something I hope people will start growing in North America. I'm going through these things quickly because all of them are written down on my website, mushroomsatcascadia.com. But it's an important medicinal mushroom that's an edible. It looks kind of like a potato, and you eat it kind of like a potato. There's a lot of different things that are reishi, so I don't know quite what to think about it. But I want to talk about what's coming soon. The Medicinal Mushroom Committee of the North American Mycological Association. My request started.
And now I think he said something about the 2005 was in the future or something. So that's an old talk. It sounded like he was
I'm
about to produce something, but it was a long time ago.
Oh, yeah. I think
I started writing about
talking
this
about
stuff.
a lot of stuff back.
I have been
Back in the
publishing
day.
about mushrooms since
No, I'm talking about the
1972.
talk
So,
itself was dated. Is that not right?
well,
I don't. think the talk is dated. I think he
This talk is brand new.
updated.
It's
Very, very.
So no.
Okay.
You need to mute yourself.
anyway, we want to figure out a good clinical trial to understand what's going on with these mushrooms. It's going to cost about $1 billion. And there's no financial incentive for a pharmaceutical company to lay out any money at all. So what we've been working on and are about to release is a database program where you can report your experience with either medicinal and or culinary mushrooms. And depending on, it's a fairly short survey, but depending on what you say, if you say you've had cancer, then it'll open up some new questions for you to answer. And if you don't mention cancer, it won't. And that is about to be released. And we're hoping that that study will be a guide to the future. But I really wanted people to see the data on these mushrooms at Cascadia.com. And it's under Michael's extracts that the articles are there. Now, I started posting these articles 2 years ago, and I haven't discovered anything new like the potential use of psilocybin for folks with HDHD, for example. That work is 2 weeks old. This is all brand new active stuff. I was diagnosed with skin cancer a year ago, August, and they did a surgery and cut off the skin cancer, but I had a lot of precancerous cells. I was using a cream made with Trametes, Tremella fusiformis, and added mushroom extracts to it. And again, the recipes are all on mushrooms of Cascadia.com. When I went back in 3 months for a follow-up checkup, all the precancerous sites were gone. Last summer, a friend came to me and she said she had some skin issues. She didn't specify what. I made a cream for her. In a month, she met with her dermatologist. He gave her a clean bill of health, told her to come back in a year. And she came to my house with a couple of cases of wine and said, well, what I didn't tell you is I've had to have cancer removed every 3 months for years now. And I started using your creams, and a month after that, I cleaned them all up. There was nothing for the dermatologist to do. And he gave me a year before I had to come back. And in my case, when I saw my dermatologist in August, he said, come back in a year. So I am incredibly excited about the potential. In 2005, I was totally discouraged, and I did not think medicinal mushrooms were of interest. I didn't see the value. I began to change my mind in 2010, but I got deeply involved in 2021 when I was asked to help this woman with an incurable lung cancer. And now she's dancing to rock and roll music every day, happy and cheerful, because the pain that she's had for 25 years is gone as well. And in the last year, I've had 3 women with just minor cases of breast cancer, but they detected the cancer. And then when they went back for the surgeon to do the surgery to remove the cancer that they'd seen a month earlier, there was no cancer there, and there's been no recurrence. And probably the most exciting thing was in January 3rd, my dental surgeon friend referred one of his patients to talk to me. She was an oncology nurse, very serious, senior experienced oncology nurse who had and supposedly been cured of metastatic ovarian cancer. But at Christmas, she noted bleeding, vaginal bleeding, and she went in and had an ultrasound. There was a growth on her liver, and her liver enzymes were off the charts. And we sat and chatted for a couple of hours on January 3rd. That's a Saturday. She ordered this stuff, the stuff I recommended, airmail, and it arrived on the 6th. She started it on January 20th of this year. She texted me. She said she had had her scan, and they didn't find anything on the liver, so they did not cut her open to do a biopsy. They didn't see anything to remove. A couple of days later, I got another email from her saying all of her liver enzymes turned out to be back to normal. All of her blood chemistry is normal. Now, I haven't heard more from her, but this is incredibly exciting. It's still experimental, and there's a number of people trying this. And if you're interested, this is the material. I don't get anything out of it other than I'm trying to save lives. And that's it. Are there any questions?
Hey, Michael.
Yes.
Hi, this is Riley from Denver, Colorado. New to mycology, so I'm excited to be here and very grateful to attend this talk and learn more. Always diving into as many books as I can, as much reading, and I'm checking out your website too while you're talking. I encourage all of you to check out that link in the chat to the website if you don't see it already. There's some great stuff on there. My question for you is, for alternative modes of healing, what do you think is keeping more people from utilizing these effective and more natural forms of treatment? Like, why isn't this more well known, or why aren't we utilizing, mushrooms in this way more prevalently, specifically in Colorado, but also in the US? I'm just curious.
Well, we are a very mycophobic culture, and there's not good data out there. And when I started it, I went to my first medicinal mushroom conference in 1976, the same year I did my first hallucinogenic mushroom conference. And I got excited, and I tried some of the teas they recommended, first on my administrative assistant who got breast cancer, and it didn't work for her. And then on a colleague, I gave some to a colleague's mother, and didn't work for her. And I'm just sort of waiting to see till some good data was gathered. And there's been no organized gathering of data. And one thing I think, one thing different in what I've been doing is I'm using mycelium rather than fruit bodies. Now, fruit bodies in some cases have very important chemicals that are going to be useful. And so in some of the formulations, like in lion's mane, they use half fruit bodies and half the mycelium. But also it's the mycelium with the rice or the bran that it had been grown on, because it turns out when you grow the mushrooms on the rice or the bran, that rice or the bran, whatever you grow it on, it is converted to an active medicinal compound. And and the myceliated rice or the myceliated oats or whatever it was, plus the mycelium, is far more effective than either one separately or the sum of the two. And importantly, you'll see a lot of criticisms as you search the internet. Well, they say, well, first of all, don't use the mycelium. It's only the fruit body that works. Well, the reason I think the mycelium is better than the fruit body is, think about the fungal fruit itself. It's these microscopic threads that are extremely porous. They pass enzymes out into the soil, and then they break down rocks, they break down organic matter, and they bring stuff back in. But that porous nature, and in the soil where they're exposed to all these things, there's no physical structures that prevents them being attacked by a parasitic plant, a parasitic mushroom, eaten by a nematode, eaten by God knows what, killed by a bacteria, attacked by a virus. So the mycelium has to defend against all of these things simultaneously. And medicinally, we've known for a long time that there's important chemicals in the mushrooms that can be used in cancer treatment. And there's two chemicals that have been used isolated for decades from turkey tail. I happen to think that's the wrong approach because those two chemicals attack an enzyme that the mushroom needs to grow. And my doctorate, by the way, is in enzyme kinetics, drug design. I was a National Institute of Health fellow. But I think it's important that you add the chemicals that are in the mushrooms that out and out kill the mushroom. Kill not the mushroom, but kill the cancer. That is, they're cytotoxic chemicals. There's also chemicals that stop the blood vessel recruitment that the mushroom needs to go. And there's chemicals that basically hyperactivate your gut microbiome. And we've only recently discovered the importance of the gut microbiome. But when you have 200 papers a year being published on medicinal mushrooms, that's not a lack of interest. I mean, if I go back 20 years, I'm looking at over 20,000 papers published about it. But there's no money for a doctor to take up any of these things. And there's not a good information network for people to share the information. And that's what I'm hoping we can start to accomplish with this new NAMA initiative of the questionnaire. But quite honestly, I'm in disbelief at how these things work and how effectively they work and how important they are. But some of it has just been, well, in the case of the psilocybin and the value of psilocybin and psilocin, that's intentional suppression because they make people care about one another. And that's not what a warlike government wants.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that answer.
Yes.
By the way, while we're waiting for another statement, for people interested in psilocybin and psilocin, Eugenia Bone has a new book out, Have a Good Trip. So if you're thinking about psilocybin and psilocin, read her book first. She spent a year going to various places and trying various therapies in various settings. And she's got good information about the things to watch out for and the things to watch for. There are snakes in the grass. It's not all nice out there.
Yes. Wait. Okay. So he wants, I'm sorry, I thought he was gonna get, okay. So the question is, he was asking about the Termites phase 1 study that Paul Stament's mom was on, and they wanted to know the results of that test. And the
Well,
study.
that test was purely to do the safety. And they found that up to 9 grams a day was well tolerated by almost all of the women in the breast cancer study. It was not a test of whether or not it worked against cancer. And it was a decision of the Fred Hutch Center oncologist. She knew from what she saw that this patient was going to die. So she just loaded her up with the mushroom. She enrolled her in the study so she could legally do what she's wanted to do. And then she was able to save her life. And, and for a long time, I mean, she was on Herceptin and Taxol. And a lot of people in NAMA said, well, that wasn't significant because the particular breast cancer that she had is 70% of the time is curable just with Herceptin and Taxol. But what they didn't recognize is Herceptin doesn't work at all if the lymph nodes are enlarged. And you may remember that I mentioned her lymph nodes were the size of walnuts. And until a retired Canadian oncologist who's on the NAMA committee spent a year teaching me how to understand cancers and how to type cancers, I didn't know the significance. So at first I thought, okay, it doesn't really prove much that she survived because 70% of the people survived, but 0% of the people survived with the cancer at the level it was when she was being treated. That's what I didn't learn until literally a year and a half ago, when I had learned how to really understand cancer, and I sit in with oncologists on these cancer trials and the reports on the drugs and how they're working. And those things, that's really changed me.
Okay, what was your question? Next question is, why do some mushrooms cause paralysis?
We don't know. They're neurological. They call it, and I presume she's talking about some of the psilocybe mushrooms. It's the mushrooms that grow on wood, not the ones that grow on grass and grow on dung do not cause the paralysis. It's the wood inhabiting ones, and the chemical that's triggering that reaction hasn't been isolated yet. We don't have an answer, and those mushrooms contain some chemicals I'm very interested in, but until we resolve the paralysis part, we've got to stick to things like psilocybe cubensis and liberty caps, which don't have those same chemicals. But I don't even know what the toxin is in morels. It can kill you if you don't cook them and you eat a lot. And we haven't got a clue. And I'm a chemist, and I've tried to do some of these things. I tried to find out why Amanita pantherina group is so much more toxic than Amanita muscaria. They're the same two main active ingredients. But there's something else in the Amanita pantherina group. I can see it on a chromatograph, but it's not stable. So I haven't been able to analyze it and figure out its structure. And I haven't been able to isolate it and test it against organisms. So part of it is the challenge of doing the chemistry. And there's no money. I paid for all of this stuff myself. I couldn't get any grants.
All right.
That the mushrooms can compete with biologics that are out there to suppress the immune system for overactive immune systems.
Okay. Say it one more time. Is there any indication
Biologics that cost $5,000 a month.
is there any indication that mushrooms can, God damn it, compete with the biologics that cost like $5,000 a month to suppress the immune system for overactive immune systems?
I don't know anyone who's worked on it, but the drug that lung cancer patient was on was in that price range per day, and the cost of the mushrooms was in the $5 a day range. But there's a lot that isn't known. I mean, I'm only just barely scratching the surface. And it depends on who contacts me, and then also whether or not they get back to me. Most people, I give them the information and I never hear from them again. So I don't know what's happened. But I do know that I've convinced a number of surgeons and I've convinced a number of oncologists, and the Fred Hutch Center was about to start a study with Paul and was about to call me, but you can thank certain current government for the fact that that's not going to happen. I.e. Musk, shut it all down, cut all the funding.
Okay.
Michael, I have a question for you. This is Susan from Denver as well. I'm curious about your chemical analysis. What have you used to test some of the, especially the medicinal mushrooms? I'm sure historically there's been a lot of studies on them, but for some of the tests that you run, how are you testing for these chemical compounds specifically, especially for the medicinal mushrooms?
Well, I retired from active lab chemistry in 1999. And so I'm not doing any of the testing. And one of the reasons I use Paul Stamets Host Defense products is he's got a large team of PhD scientists. And what he's primarily doing is doing test tube things. He's not testing for specific chemicals. I know one of his competitors tests for beta-D-glucan. And so the higher the beta-D-glucan, the happier he is with the product. Well, to me, that's just one important chemical out of many. I'm more interested in the overall impact of the mushroom or the extract on a mushroom growth, and that's called in vitro. And then you move it on up. If that looks promising, you move it up to in vivo studies in mice, etc. And then you move it on up to humans. And there are some human studies going on, but it is staggeringly expensive. And that's the challenge. And that's why we're introducing this NAMA study to just sort of find out what people have done. But I will be interested in finding out who's doing what kind of chemistry and why. But looking for any one specific chemical, I think that's the wrong approach. I'm totally convinced that's the wrong approach. We've extracted at least 100 and maybe several hundred different drugs that are effective against cancer from mushrooms and used them clinically. The problem is by themselves, they don't work well enough, and or they often quit working within a few years. So my interest is very different from what's going on in most of the country. It's in this holistic approach. And it's not because I believe that a holistic approach is better, but I have some specific chemical reasons. I want to attack the cancer or the diabetes from every single angle that I can simultaneously, because cancers are notorious for you'll kill off all the cells that are susceptible to your one treatment, but there'll be cells that survive that aren't susceptible. Then they reproduce, and so pretty soon whatever you've been doing doesn't work. So the idea, and it's something that we experimented with informally with this friend I wasn't doing the experimenting, but his wife was, by mixing things up, hoping to keep the cancer at bay. But in the end, she decided she was not making good enough progress and switched to a chemotherapy drug, and he promptly died. And she's now convinced that that's why he died. He'd still be alive. He died last year. But it's an art at this point, and it'll remain an art for the rest of my lifetime, which I hope is going to be another 10 to 20 years. I'm only in my low 80s at this point.
All right, Greg.
With psilocybin and cluster headaches, are you aware of any other research that focuses on physical health in psilocybin?
Other than research with psilocybin and cluster headaches, is there any other research that you're aware of going on with physical conditions?
Probably about 500 studies at about 100 different colleges and universities. And unfortunately, they're not all in the United States because all the US studies have been shut down, but a lot of them are in England, Canada, and other countries. There's tremendous excitement about it.
What kind of physical conditions?
Well, I mean, I mentioned that the folks that have ADHD and all the related diseases where you don't interact well with people, the mushrooms help reprogram your brain where you start interacting more effectively. And in a study that came out last week, they're finding that the degree of reprogramming of the brain, if you go at a microdose, there's no reprogramming that they can detect. At a heroic dose, the reprogramming will last 6 months to a year. But you get up to a 3 times heroic dose, and you can reprogram a brain pretty much permanently. But it varies with individuals. Some people are 10 to 100 times more susceptible than others. So it's a statistical game that you're playing, and this is true with all medicine. You'll have something. I have a friend who was treated with a cancer drug. She was in the big study. She's the only one who lived. Everyone else died in the whole study, but she went complete remission. Now, if I just knew about her and nobody else on that drug, I'd say, oh, this is a miracle drug. But with a 99.9% failure and a 0.1% success, you're gonna, it's just biology. It's not cut and dried.
Okay. Question.
Substance abuse and depression, but you kind of sound like bipolar is different. Like, what is the common bipolar?
The question is, what is the concern with using using mushrooms with bipolar disorder, and how does it different from ADHD?
Oh, it can cause, especially if you're on lithium, a really severe psychotic episode, and it'll make the bipolar disorder far worse, not better.
Yes. What extractions do you prefer for medicinal mushrooms, and why?
What? Start again?
What extraction processes do you prefer?
Oh, well, again, that's going to depend on exactly what you're after. An aqueous extraction for sure, but often both an aqueous extraction and a hot water extraction. But then, I mean, an ethanol extraction. So you need them both. But the other thing you've got to be careful about is you want to keep your extraction temperatures at around 70 degrees. You don't want Celsius. You don't want them getting up to around 100 Celsius because you're going to break down and destroy a lot of material. Conversely, shiitake has an important anti-cancer drug in it called lentinin. But lentinin in about 4% of the people causes a thing called shiitake flagellate dermatitis. It causes the rupture of your microcapillaries, and you look like you've been beaten with a cat of nine tails, and you're going to feel like that for a week or two. It's extremely painful, extremely scary. But at 70 degrees, that lentinin is destroyed. Not quickly, but if you cook it for an hour or so, it's all gone. And so one of the things I'm doing in making the teas for the shiitake teas is making sure that somebody's not going to get any lentinin. So it seems counterintuitive that I'm fighting cancer, but the first thing I do is in that case, is to kill an anti-cancer drug that's in the mushroom. But it's because that drug has a side effect that is pretty devastating. So there's not, it really is kind of a detailed knowledge of a whole bunch of individual drugs. And so the paper that I did last summer in McIlvainea is separated by the particular, so there's a section just on Termetes versicolor and all the different things all the different studies about it, and another paper on Tremella fusiformis, and another section just on reishi, and so there's just all these separate sections, and then there's a section where people are doing multiple things at a time. It's still an art form. And all I can do is say, this has worked for somebody. And if you have and pretty much my standard recipe has worked for every different cancer where somebody has come to me and said, hey, we've got this problem. If people have tried it, so far they're all alive and doing better. But so far is only since 2021. I mean, I didn't really become a believer until recently. But seeing is believing. When you see a huge tumor and the surgeon says, we can't help you, and the patient says, well, cut it out, and he says, that's going to make it worse, just live with it. And I treat it with a cream that I think might work but don't know, and it's gone within 45 days, I become a believer. And I'll tell you, that surgeon sure became a believer when he saw the patient, and then brought all the nurses over to show the nurses. He was shocked and impressed. That's all I can say. We're try it. It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, and it may save your life. That's all that's my story.
Okay, we had another question up here. Yeah, what kind of fungi would you recommend for avoiding cancer? What do we just say? Prevention, like cancer prevention.
Well, do you remember that very first slide I showed in this section? Boletes, especially king boletes, any hericium, any oyster mushroom, and the yellow mushrooms are the very best. The king oysters are second best, but the wild mushrooms are extremely good. And shiitake, way high on the list. Not only that, but it's just so, I mean, that's what, I made a batch of shiitake tea this morning. So for dinner tonight, we had sauteed shiitake on pizza. So you don't throw anything away. In fact, many people I buy dry shiitake now because it's cheaper than fresh and easier. And whenever we run out of tea, I make a new batch, and we have 2 pizza nights in a row. So one night, one batch of the tea is good enough for 2 pizza meals. And it's all going to be good for you. The anti-inflammatory ability of mushrooms is possessed by almost all of them. And if I had to single out just one most important feature, that would be it.
Okay, we have a question in the chat that says, when using an aqueous extraction method, do you always want to start with a dried powdered form of the mushroom?
I don't do it, so that's going to be a question that I know that the person who makes the extracts for me starts with the dried products from Paul Stamets' company, the Host Defense from Fungi Perfecti, because it's not just that it's a dry powder, but they have studied hundreds of different cultivars, for example, of turkey tail, and they only grow and process the very best cultivar. And the example I'm going to make will be penicillin. In World War II, we knew that penicillin could save lives, but Penicillin notatum, the fungus, produces very little penicillin. And so all across the United States and Canada, housewives were asked to send in their moldy fruit, their moldy bread, and that was tested. And one woman, I think it was from Iowa, sent in a moldy cantaloupe that was incredibly better at producing penicillin than any other sample that anyone sent in. So all penicillin that you get is from that original cantaloupe. And so that's why I like to use Paul's Host Defense product, because he's done a process like that. And I'm going to be, if I'm using turkey tails, I'm going to be using turkey tail from the very best cultivar of turkey tail. And that was something I saw clearly when I was doing the psilocybin research. One collection and another can vary greatly in concentration in the same species. So he's done the research to find the really potent species. So I don't rely on going in the wild to pick anything for medicine. Now, I don't mind doing it for culinary use, for food, because it's not critical that you get the most powerful bang for your buck, you know. But if I'm going to fight cancer or some other serious disease, I'm going to start with a tested product that I know is potent.
Okay. Next question is, do you have any recommendations on mushrooms that are safe for pregnant women or even good for babies?
Well, no mushrooms should be fed to young children below about the age of, especially below 4, but by 5 or above, they start to have a better developed digestive system. But there's no evidence that they're a problem in the fetus. So if let's do a hypothetical situation where the woman has just been, she's pregnant and has been diagnosed, I don't pick your cancer, you know, and pick breast cancer, that's a common one. Now, how are you going to treat it? The safest, anything you do is potentially going to present some risk to the fetus. By far, the lowest risk is going to be the mushroom. And the mushrooms, by the way, are really good for human papilloma virus. So they kill viruses. They're actually a combination of turkey tail and agarikon. And this is a paper that came out about 3 months ago now. So it's an ancient paper. It's really effective against COVID-19. And it more than doubles the utility of a vaccine, and the vaccine works twice as long and much better if you've been consuming turkey tail and agarikon prior to your vaccination. But when I got COVID, and I've had it once, I got it at NAMA this fall, I came home still feeling okay, kissed my wife and was around the family. That night I felt bad. I immediately went to high dose mushrooms. By the next night, the COVID was over. And nobody else got sick because everyone else was already on high dose mushroom. Just one example, but it sure worked for me.
Yes. What do you mean by high dose mushroom? Can you give
8 grams.
quantity of what kind of mushroom were you talking about specifically in that?
8 grams of turkey tail and a half a gram of agarikon.
Okay. Yeah.
Now you can go safely as far as now I'll talk as my 50 years on the Toxicology Committee. You could go to 80 grams, but you don't need, I mean, safely, but that's going to cost a lot of money or take a lot of time or might even cause a Beozar in your intestines from too much fiber. So 8 grams, that's your high dose. And low dose is 1 to 2 grams. And
Okay.
just depending on the cancer, the disease, what you're trying to do, you do something in that range.
All right. Next question.
You recommend from precancerous.
What mushroom would you recommend for precancerous skin conditions?
Well, I mean, that's what I do is I have the Tremella fusiformis, which itself is an anti-cancer mushroom that has been used for 2,000 years by the Chinese as an anti-cancer sunscreen that also clarifies the skin, clears up age spots. I've seen age spots just wipe away with the stuff, but I like to put some turkey tail extract in, some lion's mane extract. I actually make one mixture for the morning and a different mixture for the evening. So I put up to 3 different extracts in the morning. And in this case, I'm putting in 14% extract by weight, but no more than 3, sometimes just 2 at 14% by weight. And then whatever you want. But the important thing is to vary it, not do the same thing all the time. So I have pretty much, but my favorites by far are turkey tail is #1, far and away. Agarikon you use less of because it's expensive and hard to get, but Agarikon plus turkey tail is synergistic, so I like to use the two together. Lion's mane, cordyceps I use with care, but cordyceps, but it's all in the those handouts on my website. And in terms of toxicology, by the way, this has nothing but cancer. The next issue of Fungi magazine is entirely devoted to mushroom poisoning and diagnosis. So look for that coming out this summer.
Then Riley Online says, what do you wish your younger self knew when you first started in the field of mycology?
Oh man. What I know now, but it takes time to learn it. I mean, I was enthusiastic, but didn't know the right things to do. Now and Fungi perfecti didn't exist yet. They hadn't tested all these things. And there's a lot of research going on, but the research is going on globally. I'm not kidding. You literally can't keep up with the new papers.
Any other questions? Cool. Oh, one more.
We're looking for the turkey tail of cream. Where do you get that?
You know, I think he made it, and I think you can find it on his website. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. I have some of his new books here for sale that are signed by him for $25. You can do cash or you can Venmo me or whatever. And for the people online who are not here to get one, we'll have more at the fair too. So don't worry, you can get one later. But thank you, Mike.
Okay.
All right.